Well, hi everyone. Welcome. It's my honor to welcome all of you today to our fall 2023 Jammy Career Webinar Series. So this month's topic is called Got Clicks, and it's designed to help you boost your professional brand using multimedia tools. And we have a great lineup of speakers today who are going to speak about their own professional experiences utilizing social media. So my name is Yas Hardaway, and I'm the Executive Director of Career Services at GSEP. And this program is a partnership between our GSEP Career Services, Alumni Relations, and Writing Support teams. So for those of you who are new to our Jammy Communities of Practice programs, you may be wondering, what is Jammy? Jammy is a Swahili term for community, and our Jammy Communities of Practice programs are designed to provide you with up-to-date labor market information and help you expand your professional community. In the fall, we host our Jammy Career Webinars, which are moderated Q&A panels. And in the spring, we host our Jammy Career Connect sessions, which are interactive learning sessions through breakout room discussions. So I'm going to jump now to our agenda and share briefly our learning outcomes, some housekeeping items, and then I'll transition it over to my colleague, Dr. Renee Dorn, who is our Director of Alumni Relations, and she'll be introducing our two panelists, and we'll facilitate a moderated Q&A with them. And then we will open it up to you all. I know that you all will probably come with questions as well, either in the chat, or you'll have an opportunity to unmute yourself and ask questions as well. And then you'll get to hear a little bit more about some of the writing support resources that our team has curated for you to support some of the topics that we're going to be discussing today. And then we'll share a little bit about what's next for November. So our housekeeping items, the session is being recorded, and you'll have an opportunity to access this recording later through our participant drive, and we'll put our participant drive link in the chat. You are welcome to use the live transcription option. And then I would like to just encourage you, if you are able to use the rename tool to change your name, to include your first and last name, if possible, so that we can see who is in our Zoom room today. Okay, so our learning outcomes, what do we hope that you will receive from this session? We hope that you will gain clarity about different multimedia projects that can support the next step in your career planning. We hope that you'll increase your confidence in your ability to successfully move forward toward your career objective. And then we hope that you'll be able to expand or connect to working professionals from our Pepperdine community. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Renee Dorn, our Director of Alumni Relations, who will introduce our panelists. Dr. Dorn?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Yaz, and welcome everyone to our webinar today. And I'm so excited as Director of Alumni Relations to introduce to you two alums who have done fantastic things in their areas of expertise. And so first, I'd like to introduce Lori Gottlieb. She is a GSEP alum for the MA in Clinical Psychology. She's a psychotherapist, a TED Talk speaker, New York Times best-selling author of the book, Maybe You Should Talk to Someone. She has a column called Dear Therapist with The Atlantic. And then she also has a podcast of the same name, Dear Therapist. So welcome, Lori. Welcome to our webinar today.
There we go. I said, thank you so much for having me.
Yes, it's so wonderful to hear from you today and to see you. I'm going to ask you a lot of questions about your brand because I've listened to your TED Talk and some of your podcasts and went on your website, so I have a lot of questions for you. So you just hold on. I'm going to introduce speaker number 2, who is another GSEP alum from the Doctor of Education for Organizational Leadership program. Also one of my cohort colleagues and friends, Dr. J. Lamar Gray, also known as Dr. J. He is Vice President of Programming for New HD Los Angeles, that's radio, and host of the Strictly Business Show with Dr. J. So hello, Dr. J. How are you today?
Hello, Dr. Dorn. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Now, Dr. J is also a published author in the Journal of Workplace Learning and International Journal of Learning and Development. So, Dr. J, I'm going to be asking you some questions today regarding your expertise in the business field and radio, and talk a little bit about that. So, are you ready?
Oh, sure.
Oh my goodness, I know you're ready to get started. Okay, let's get started. Let's bring Lori back so the three of us can have a conversation. All right. So for both of you, and I'm going to start with you, Lori, we're talking about branding. And so how did you get started with your brand? Because as you said, you're a psychotherapist and you have a podcast, you have a book, um, a newspaper columnist. So how did you actually create the brand that you have and then carry it over into the other areas of social media?
So it's interesting when people talk about brands. I wrote a piece for the New York Times Magazine called "What Brand is Your Therapist?" And it was all about when I was starting out and I had just finished all of my requirements and I got licensed and I was going to hang up my shingle. And I was hearing people talk about branding and it felt so strange. It was something that was so different from, I think, what we were thinking about as therapists in terms of the work that we were doing, the clinical work. And I remember really chafing at that, and I still kind of do. I don't think I set out to build a brand, and that's what I say in that piece if people want to read it. And that was written a long time ago, and I think I stayed true to that, which is that I feel like when we go public, I think most of us, what we're wanting to do is to kind of democratize therapy, provide access. With, we can only reach a limited number of people in our clinical work. So how can we reach more people? So, and I think it's interesting because with Maybe You Should Talk to Someone with my book, everyone said, oh, no one's going to read that. It's like no one wants to read about stories from the therapy room. And, that's like nothing happens. And I said, okay, well, for the three people who are going to read it, I wanted it to be real and authentic. And I included, it follows the lives of four very different patients. And then I'm the fifth client in the book and I go to therapy. And so you see kind of therapy from both sides. And the book ended up, I mean, it's sold 2 million copies at this point, and it's all over the world. And I think it was the authenticity. And so when we talk about branding, whether it's my column or my podcast or my TED Talk or whatever, it's really about what is your mission and how are you putting that mission out there. I did not set out to sell 2 million copies of this book. I set out to put something out there that, if you want to talk about brand, that was authentic to me. And I think that it's very clear, at least I can see, I think I can see when people are kind of trying to design a brand or trying to actually, they're doing something that is meaningful to them and people then engage with that content.
It's interesting that you mentioned that you created something that was authentic to you, because when we look at social media right now, a lot of times we sort of ask ourselves, are people compromising their integrity just to get likes or to be noticed or to be followed? So I like the fact that you said that you focused on your authenticity in order to create what you have today.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Dr. Gray, I'm going to ask you, what about you putting together your brand? You have the podcast Strictly Business Show with Dr. J. Why did you focus on the business aspect? You've been in radio for so many years. So how did you transition to that?
My story is a long misplaced story. I tell you, I never was a great student in high school. I was a C student. I barely graduated. I ended up going to Chaffee Community College and majoring in broadcasting. I dropped out, ended up working in the entertainment industry, from television, mostly radio, as a radio engineer for years for some major radio stations, worked with Tom Likas, Jim Lampley, Irish Restell, a bunch of people. My mission was to work in broadcasting the rest of my life. And then all of a sudden, it fell apart. It fell apart. The corporate structure took over broadcasting. All the small guys went away, like Gene Autry, who used to own the old KMPC I worked for back in the day. And then all of a sudden I found myself just floundering. And then I said, I'm going to go back to school. And I went back to school just to do away with broadcasting and television, everything. And I went back and got all my degrees and ended up at Pepperdine University, basically on a bet, because my sister told me, you're not the doctorate type. And I entered the program and got in. Went through the program successfully, obviously. And when I left with a doctorate degree, I thought I was going to go into learning and development. And I did for a little bit. I went to learning development. I'm good in front of people. I'm a great speaker. And I did that. And I enjoyed that, but the work wasn't really there. And then all of a sudden, I was struggling around looking for work. And yes, you too can have a doctorate degree and struggle and look for work if you're not in your right field or your right mission in life. And then a friend of mine who's passed on now, I worked in radio, Mark Morris, he said, what was your doctorate in? I said, organizational leadership, learning in the workplace. He said, well, you're a radio guy. Why don't you do a radio show about it? And I was like, oh, a radio show, a podcast. He said podcast. And I said, oh, a podcast. That's so podcasty. And then I developed this show. I said, okay, fine. If I'm gonna do a radio show about business in the workplace, I'm gonna do it my way. Do it the way I want to do it. And I focused on business because that's what we talked about, organizational leadership. And that's when I came up with the concept of doing the show as unfortunately a lonely podcast. And then I've been doing it for like 6 years now. And I eventually got on a syndication network, CRN Digital Talk. And that's how I came back to the broadcasting industry. And I haven't looked back since. I figured that's where I belong, right there. And I've been building my brand ever since then.
That's fantastic. And so let me go back to asking both of you, both with the podcast and the broadcasting. Lori, one thing you mentioned is storytelling. And in a sense, both of you are telling stories. One, you're talking about maybe the stories that you hear from your patients in therapy, and then Dr. J, stories having to do with business and what you experienced and what's going on in the business world. So with that storytelling, and I like what you said, Lori, in your TED Talk, when you change our stories, we change our lives. So how is it that we can take our own stories and maybe create the brand and be authentic to ourselves so that other people can see that in the work that we do?
So I think a great example of that is the podcast. So on Dear Therapists, it's me with another fellow person that I met at TED, Guy Winch, who's a psychologist in New York. And we like the idea of having two therapists do actual sessions with people. So we do real sessions with real people as if they just walked into our office. We don't know the questions beforehand, or that like they write in a letter, then they come on the show. And what we like about the rewriting the stories is that at the end, we give them homework that they have 1 week to do. And then they report back and they let us know how it went. And I think that what we're trying to do is kind of demystify these stories about therapy, that you're going to go to therapy, you're going to be there for years, you're going to download the problem of the week, nothing's going to change, right? And and you're going to talk about your childhood forever. And it's about, how can we help people now? Like even one session, how does that help people move or shift or do something that they had never been able to do before? And so for us, it's really about this idea of using real stories to show how we have agency to change our lives.
Interesting. So Dr. J, saying, when you're talking about business on the podcast, so how do you make that more personal, or how can, when people hear you, how can they relate to what you're saying?
My interpretation of story is a little different. I don't try to think like that. I use my personal story as my motivation in my format and how I do the show and my delivery. Mm-hmm. So I don't always go out of my way to try to tell my story. I let my format and my content present my story. If you listen to my show, you can tell a lot about me. You can tell my quirky sense of humor. You can tell my, how seriously I take things, or certain topics I choose. So sometimes I don't think you really have to tell your story per se. Use your story to allow I think people can kind of feel your story and your energy based on your presentation and how you deliver yourself, from the bass in your voice to the nonverbal movements and the content you choose. So I try to use my story just to motivate my delivery and the content I choose and how I do the show.
Okay, interesting, very interesting. Now, I also want to ask, as you were building your brand and building the podcast, how did you get the information to the people so that you could build a following to the point where when it's time to have a book, you have people out there who are saying, hey, I'm interested in purchasing your book. I hear you every day. So how did you build that following along the way or over time? And Lori, I'll start with you.
Sure. So I had been a writer for many years before I was a therapist. I had a career. First, I worked in entertainment in Hollywood. I worked in film development. Then I was an executive at NBC, and then all these things led up to eventually going back to grad school and becoming a therapist. And so I think that I had always expressed myself through writing. And so I had, people talk a lot about platform. What is your platform? And I think I just already had one because I had been a writer out in the national conversation before that, but not really in the therapy community so much. And I think that there was like this disconnect between people who knew me as a writer and then people who knew me as a therapist. And in fact, I used to have two different websites, like my writing one and my therapy one, because I thought, well, I have to keep my boundaries very clear here about the writer me and the therapist me. And then I realized that's so strange because I am a writer who is a therapist. I am a therapist who is a writer. And so now, everybody just kind of knows me in my entirety of what I do. And I've always been the same person. It's not like you can cut off the writer part of me or the therapist part of me, because the things that I'm interested in as a writer are things about what makes us tick, what's happening in the culture and how does that affect our emotional health. Mm-hmm. And the things that interest me as a therapist are the same things that interest me as a writer. And even as a therapist, I feel like I'm editing people's stories as I'm working with them clinically. And my workbook, in fact, is all about a step-by-step guide to editing your stories. So that's something that I use the part of me that's a writer. How do I edit as a writer to help people, kind of therapeutically through this medium through this metaphor of how do we edit our stories. So I think that one of the things that was really important was when we talk about platform is just that you are who you are. And I like, Dr. J, what you were saying about how you bring yourself, that's sort of your story. I think that when you're building your platform, you're putting out what is important to you and who you are. And people will respond to that or not. And the people who do, those are the people who are going to be interested in what you put out there. And you can't worry so much about trying to please all the people all the time. There are lots of people who, don't like what I put out there, and that's fine too. But my community is for whoever wants to be there.
And you know what? I'm glad you mentioned that. And I want to ask Dr. J, how did you decide on what community you were reaching out to? Because Lori, you said, some people may like what you put out there and some people may not, but how do you target, I guess, who your audience is going to be or who you want to be as a part of your audience? So Dr. J, I'm going to ask you first.
That's an interesting question. A very good question too, because I initially thought my show was going to be for academic people. I called it initially the workplace zone. As corny as that is, I called it the workplace zone. And I thought my show was just going to be a quiet little show for academic people to tune into and listen to and have a conversation. And I learned real fast that academia people didn't like me. They loathed me. They did not respond at all. They criticized me, and they still do. Academia people troll me big time. They challenge me every step of the way. So I said, okay, this is not for you then. and they would challenge me. And I said, listen, I have a 10-minute segment here I'm doing. I don't have time to break out the PowerPoint and do all this for you. But if you want to meet me somewhere and if you pay me, I'll gladly come to your class and embarrass you. But but besides that, so I was in a DMV one day and I said, I'm tired of just talking about workplace issues. And I was actually in the DMV in the line and I was reading Inc. magazine and I was looking at all these different stories. And I said, man, maybe I should cover more business side of it. So that's when I came up, the Strictly Business Show was born. And I decided that, okay, I want my audience to be the everyday people who just work every day. They go and work, they do this, they do that, and they can relate to kind of like Seinfeld was a water cooler show. I want to do a water cooler radio show about business. What do everyday employees actually talk about or complain about? The boss, this and that. I did a segment once on 10 ways to get your boss fired, right? To how to set your boss up. But the learning from that was that if you follow these 10 steps, there's something maybe wrong with you, that you actually follow these 10 steps. Because I was like, hey, put cocaine in their desk. But listen to me. I was saying though, if it's gotten that far, you may not, the problem may not be your boss, the problem may be you. If you're going to that extent. So it was a learning moment there. So eventually that blossomed to pop culture now. So now I talk about pop culture items in the news. And I said, that's my audience. Take a pop culture theme like Jada Pinkett's new book and talk about the business side of it. So that's how I decided my audience. I went from academia people to everyday work people. And that's why I said, that's my audience right there. Everyday people who just talk about the normal things in business and the workplace.
So there was a transition.
Oh, big time.
Right. Big time. So Lori, was it the same with you? There was a transition to get to where you are today?
I think what I've noticed is that there are two different broad groups of people who engage with my content. And there's the therapeutic community, and then there's just everybody, like a human, being a person in the world. And what I find is that just like you found with Dr. Day, with the, with the academic community, the therapeutic community, the biggest trolls. I cannot even, it's astounding. It's just astounding. Like, I don't understand it. I don't know why people think that like a tweet that you put out is somehow the entirety of that session. If I'm like, here's a little snippet of something. Well, why didn't you explore this in that session? You didn't do this. You were giving advice. It's like, I'm giving you a 2-line moment of something, and I'm giving that as a redacted to anonymous with permission to share some concept that I think is universal and that we could all hear today, that we all need this reminder today. Or we might learn something, or if you don't have access to therapy and you want to learn something about how to have better relationships or something self-sabotaging or something you're doing in your own life. So it's been very interesting to see that I think what's great about having a platform is that you can reach everybody. I'm not speaking to the therapeutic community. If they learn something from this or they want to engage with that, that's great. But I'm really just speaking to anyone out there who can benefit from whatever I'm putting out there that day.
Okay, that's good to know. That's really good to know. Both of you do a lot of writing, and that's been seen with the books that you've written, the journal articles you've written, and even the programs, the podcasts. So could you tell us a little bit about your writing style and how that may be different for the podcast as opposed to the book or journal articles? So how do you come up with the writing for the programming that you do? And Dr. J, I'm going to start with you this time.
Well, I don't do much journal writing anymore, because they don't pay anything. They give you an invitation to travel across the world on your own dime, and then give you 30 minutes to stand up there and talk. But so I don't do that anymore. But a lot of my writing, my time in the Pepperdine program actually is a big part of my writing of my script, because my show is scripted. I'm not on there just talking from the top of my head. I have segments. Yes. I have a segment, the Strictly Business Headlines. I have a segment called In Case You Missed It. I do interviews. And so I break it down. It's very scripted. I have special effects and sound effects in my show to make it funny. My show is not your typical business show. We don't talk finances. We don't talk anything. Yeah.
It's almost as if you have no business training at all.
I mean, I play stuff like that throughout my show. And that's in my segment too, where I play.
Oh, you had to say.
So I have to script my show very well because I have to script it with the actual. So if I take a Jada Pinkett story, I have to script it very well to like. So my writing process is about. So Jada, you wrote this book about Will. So why'd you do that? So my writing is about writing, scripting, and being creative and putting things in there. But it's interesting that my time writing in the doctoral program is what actually came together as far as researching topics and business topics and putting things together and outlining things. So that's my process. It's creative and it's academic in a weird, strange way.
Okay, so Lori, the same with you with your writing process. Is it different from how you wrote your book as compared to putting together the podcast?
Oh yeah. So the opposite for our podcast, it's completely spontaneous. It is literally a therapy session, just like that. So there's no writing involved in that. There is writing. I write my column, my Dear Therapist column for The Atlantic. And that's really fun to do because I think that it makes me, like what Dr. J, you were just saying about creative and academic. It's something that I'm really giving people not just advice, but I'm also giving them sort of the therapeutic kind of model to think about, like, why is this happening? What might be going on? Helping people to see something from the other person's perspective that maybe they can't see. So I think that, for that, it's like a very focused kind of, I'm answering this one discrete question. But also bringing in lessons that are related to this topic, whether it's like boundaries or in-laws or, whatever it might be. And I think, for the book, it was very much, you need to really know, like, what are the chapters going to be? Like, I know everything that has already happened because it's nonfiction, but then how do you tell the story? In what order do you tell the story? How do you make it as authentic as possible to the timing of what actually happened, even though you can't literally do that in a book?
Right, exactly. So if somebody is just starting out and they want to get out there on social media, they have an idea. How do they take their idea and then create maybe a platform to where they can show their brand to the world? What would be some advice that you would give them in order to get started? And Lori, I'll start with you this
time. Again, I think setting out just with the idea that I want to create a brand, that just never really was something that I focused on. To me, it was, I really feel like I'm on a mission here. I know there are lots of other people on this same mission, and I want to be in community with them. And so to me, it was about creating community more than a brand. It's always been more about how can I create this community? How can I invite people in? How can I make it inclusive? How can we put information that I think is really important in this place, and people can share it or talk about it. So to me, it was really much more about, I want to create a community for people who have shared interests, which is the human condition. That's the shared interest.
Absolutely. Dr. J, what about you? What would be some advice that you would give someone who's starting out, trying to create something to share with the world?
Well, I actually think creating is the easy part. I think creating something is the easy part. The difficult is consistency and longevity. That's the really challenge of staying in the game. You can't, I don't want to quote Hamilton, you can't get a win unless you stay in the game. But but to start it, to answer your question directly, it all comes down to who you are and what you want to do.
Mhm.
Now, I did what I did, and don't get me wrong about my podcast or my show. When I do it, there are some doctoral organizational leadership terms that sneak out of me, and I'm like, whoa, where'd that come from? So it's still there. So it's about finding out who you are and your story and what you're comfortable with doing. I found out real quickly I was not comfortable doing a show about just the workplace for academic people.
Mhm.
So if you're not comfortable doing the show, then you have to really create something that you're comfortable with, no matter what anybody says. Rick Dees gave me some advice. I don't know if how many of you too young know who Rick Dees is. Before Ryan Seacrest, that was Rick Dees. He told me when I met him, and I told him what my show was about. He said that always do what you really want to do, because people are so wrapped up in their own heads, they'll forget what you just told them anyway. So why talk to them? Do what you're comfortable with. So I would say the first thing to do is do what you're really comfortable with, and don't ask opinions, because people, we always ask a bunch of broke people how to make money. I mean, don't ask somebody who make a six figures how do you make $1 million, and they'll answer the question too. Like they know what they tell you. You can ask a homeless person how do you make $1 million. They'll tell you something too. So you want to just get into your silo, even though most people will tell you don't do that. But get into your silo and ask yourself what you really, really, really want to do and talk about, and that's where it starts.
All right, wonderful.
Or else you will be squandering for a long time, and you'll quit and you'll give up and figure out why did that work? It didn't work because you was on the wrong path.
You know what? Both of you have given some wonderful advice and some great information. I think at this point, we should open it up for the audience questions, because I've been seeing a lot of questions coming up through the chat. So I'm going to introduce Carlos Jimenez, and he is going to do the Q&A with the audience so we can get some questions answered from those who have been listening. So Dr. J and Lori, thank you so much for everything that you have said so far. So I'm going to pass this on to Carlos so we can get some questions from the audience. Okay, Carlos.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. So I'll start with the questions in the chat. I see some have raised their hand, so we'll get to you in just a moment. And just a reminder, if we could keep the questions kind of applicable to our wider group here as we kind of go through these. But yeah, I've been marking down some of these questions in the chat. So the first one is for Lori from Jerez Mitchell. Jerez asked, how do you tackle the confidentiality piece with your podcast?
So on the podcast, people, we change all of their names and the names of the people that they talk about. So, what's your new name of your husband? What's your new name of your child? What's your new name of your boss? So everybody's names are changed. We change things like locations. If they say something, we don't tape live. So if they mess up and they accidentally say the wrong name, or they say the city, or they reveal something, we'll say, can you say that again, but without that name, or however we need to do it. So that's how we protect their confidentiality.
See. Oh, thank you. Okay, another one for Lori from Veronica Allen. Veronica asks, well, first, she loves your book and asks, were you concerned about how your clients would read it before their sessions and use it somehow against you?
I didn't think anyone would read it, including my clients, because that's what I was told. So I just kind of let it rip in terms of my story. I didn't think too much about, should I say this? Should I say that about myself? And so when I was going on book tour for the book came out, it immediately hit the New York Times list, and I still didn't think people were going to see it because I was just leaving, and I said, I'm going to be out of the office for a couple of weeks. I didn't say where I was going, and here's who's on call for me, usual. And when I came back, a lot of people walked into my office and said, so I read your book. And what was so interesting to me about that was that they weren't so interested in talking about me, but they were really interested in talking about what resonated with them, and also our relationship and what it meant about, certain things that happened between me and my therapist, they felt also were things they wanted to talk about in terms of what was happening between them and me. Like when I asked my own therapist, do you like me? Those kinds of questions or interactions. So it really deepened the work that we were doing, which I had no way of anticipating.
Excellent, thank you. Adam Hughes has a question for both speakers. During your journey from the unknown beginnings until today, what habits or activities have shown the biggest return on investment in relation to effort and time, or what efforts have returned the biggest dividends, not necessarily monetary? So maybe start with Dr. J.
What habits have I developed over the time? Was that the question?
Yes. So what habits have shown the biggest return on investment, or what efforts have you found to have, some of the biggest dividends, not necessarily monetary?
Well, like I said, my show takes a lot of preparation. I work on my show all week. It's an hour on Sunday, and I really, really have to put the work in. Like I just have a lot of sound effects. I really write my show as a comedy business show, and I have a lot of fun with it. And so I have to rehearse. I mean, although I have like a bank of like 100 sound effects. So I always got to find the story, read the story, and then find the funny in every story. And obviously some stories are off limits. I don't talk political business at all. But so for me, the constant writing, being creative, and having the academia meet the creative side of it and finding the funny in it is something that I have to work on every week, and to the night before, where I'm up changing things, going through a 3 or 4 drafts, saying, okay, that's not as funny, this is funny. So it's helped. The biggest dividend is working hard and being consistent. And once you get that muscle going, I used to rehearse my show for 3 days. Now I can rehearse it that morning before I do it. So the consistent work at it, because what you practice, you'll get good at. So getting better at the show is something that, and I used to be horrified to listen to my own voice, believe it or not. But I love listening to my voice now. But so the hard work, the dedication, that's really paid off in dividends for me.
Excellent. Another question, Madison, for Lori. Madison Lippy asks for Lori, how do you stay grounded in your mission to help people in their daily lives when you've reached such success? Is it tempting to lean into more media-based fame, income, rather than doing individual therapy sessions?
I have always loved the concept of a hybrid career. I've always done that in various ways. So to me, I think, and sort of even going back to the last question about sort of what pays off in dividends and all of that, I think that when you love what you do, and you love all parts of what you do, it takes a lot of hard work. So people think, oh, it's very glamorous. Like, you have, Dr. J has this great radio show, right? Syndicated radio show. And I have lots of things out in the media. And I don't think people realize how much thought and work go into these things, but I think that it doesn't feel like, tedious when you love what you do. It's hard. You don't always want to sit down and, butt to chair, as I always say, and sit down and do it. But because you feel so invested in what you're doing and so connected to the work that you're doing, you're willing to do that. So I don't feel like, oh, this external kind of forward-facing work that I do takes precedence over the smaller, more intimate clinical work that I do. I think they're equally important. I find them equally meaningful to me. So I would never give up one or the other. I think that they all complement each other and teach me things that make me better as a clinician and also make me better as a writer. So they're very complementary.
Excellent, thank you. A couple of hands were up here. I think Katie, is it Byam?
Yes, hi, thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you so much. Lori, I've read your book twice. I am very inspired by it, especially as someone who has spent the first half of my career in the entertainment business and reached a certain level of success. And I'm completely kind of pivoting and starting over as a student and a complete amateur. And so I guess I wanted to understand, sorry, someone stopped me. If you had any kind of words of wisdom or piece of advice for a new therapist who may be dealing with imposter syndrome or struggling to find voice and confidence in a new career?
I think that so much of what I did in my former careers applied to the skills that I needed to be a therapist. At one point, I was in medical school. Long story. If you read the book, you know. If you don't worry about it. And I remember we had this class called Doctor Patient, and I was the oldest person. I was one of the oldest people in my medical school because I had had a career in Hollywood first, and then I went to medical school. And most people were like kind of right out of undergrad or nearly right out of undergrad. And I remember in the Doctor Patient class, you had to go in and, you know, a mock patient would present whatever their symptoms were, and you had to kind of figure out how to deal with them, and you were videotaped, and then we would discuss this in class. And I was the only person who introduced myself to the patient. And I say that not because I'm so great, it's the opposite. It's that I think just because I had been out in the working world, that just was sort of an obvious thing for me to do. And I think when you're 22, maybe it's not as obvious. And so I feel like when you're starting a new career, you have to remember that you're bringing so many skills that you don't even realize with you to this work that we're doing, which is very human and requires a real sense of self. And I think having been in another career gives you that sense of self. So remember that you have that.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more. Pamela, did you have your hand up there? I'd like to ask
I
a
did.
question.
Thank you so much. Dr. J, Lori, thank you for this wonderful session. I've already learned so much in our short time together. My question is for Lori. Lori, I was fortunate enough recently to have a practicum instructor who encouraged us to write our mission, our vision, our personal values on a piece of paper. And while I was doing that exercise, I wrote what I call two versions. I had a very sort of generic one that you see all over Psychology Today, that's very general. And I had a second version that was really more me. And what I mean by that was it really blended truly the things of who I am, my life experiences, what I believe, my corporate marketing career from the past into where I want to be and do today. The problem with that more sort of real version of me is that it's really niche. And as I'm graduating this semester to become an AMFT, I think what I'm struggling with a little bit is, what do I do? Do I come out into this world as an AMFT as this sort of general version because it feels more safe? Or do I come out as what I really feel is the true me that might feel a little bit more niche and narrow? So just curious and wondering if you have any words of advice on how to sort of manage this new career path as an AMFT and these really two worlds of being a generalist, but then also doing something that's more true to myself.
I think that it's not so binary. I don't think that it has to be, you have to choose one or the other as you're starting out. I think that, first of all, it's great that you know what you want to do, but I also think that there's so much discovery that you don't even anticipate happening. So I had certain ideas about what kinds of clients I wanted to work with. And then I learned, oh, wait, I like this, but I don't like this as much, or I really enjoy this and I never expected to enjoy this. So I think you can start out focusing on both at the same time. It's a both and. So you see who you like working with, you'll figure that out over, the coming maybe year or two, while you're also working on that niche that is really powerful and meaningful for you. And I like what Dr. J, and you can speak to this yourself, Dr. J, but I like what you said earlier related to this about how you realized, this is the kind of voice and this is the kind of show that you wanted to do. And you were standing in the DMV and you said, wait a minute, this is really who I am. So I think that you want to go with that. And I think that it's great that you, again, have some idea about that, but I would kind of experiment a little in these first couple of years while you're also pursuing that, because you might be surprised and you might come up with something totally different that you hadn't expected.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much for all those questions. I'm going to pass it on to Gina Meister. She's going to share with us just a few resources on some of the writing components related to our topic.
Thank you so much, Carlos. And thank you so much, Dr. J and Lori, for all of your wisdom. It's so inspiring to hear that when you follow your true self and your interests and your passions, that brings you exactly where you need to be. So really, really very inspiring. I'm just going to share my screen and then share a few of our resources here. So this is a worksheet, a podcasting worksheet from University of Michigan, and it actually will walk you through the different steps and asks you questions to sort of brainstorm and determine what kinds of content you'd like to include, what style, who your audience is, and so on. So that's a great worksheet if you want to work on podcasting. There are some links here that I'm going to click. And more from University of Michigan on the podcast sheet, and then some guides from Cornell on script writing that I think you'll find useful. And then we have just an academic blog here sheet that will give you some background on writing an academic blog. So we hope that you find those useful, and I have a feeling that we might have some really wonderful resources from our two guests today as well. So thank you so much, Carlos. And I'm going to give this back to I think, Yaz.
Yes, thank you. And I just echo Gina, Lori, and Dr. J. You provided so much wisdom and authenticity. And I think that it made the information you shared so much more accessible to our audience. So we know that you have a very busy life. So the fact that you volunteered your time to be with us today really speaks to who you are and your support of other people's growth and development too. So thank you. Okay, so I am going to now transition to Sabrina Delgado Castellan. She's our enrollment officer.
Everyone, it was definitely a pleasure to hear from Lori and Dr. J. My name is Sabrina Castellan, and I am one of the 5 enrollment services officers here at Pepperdine's Graduate School of Education and Psychology. For those of you that are interested in applying to one of our programs here, if you're not already a member or a part of our Pepperdine family, you can definitely reach out to me or one of my colleagues. Whether you're interested in a program in the education or the psychology division, we're happy to assist you and walk you through the application process, the next steps, and just get you ready on joining our family here at Pepperdine. You might find in the chat our contact information, and you can find the list of programs that we have to offer here at GSEP. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Sabrina. And now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Usman Khan from Career Services. Usman is going to share a little bit about our commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging.
Hi, I'm Usman Khan. I serve as the career design counselor as part of our team here at Career Services. And I wanted to share about our commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. As part of our vision here at Career Services is that every graduate will have the clarity, confidence, and community to access, thrive, and transform the future workplace. And as part of our diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging efforts, our team is committed to ensuring students and alumni have access to our resources and services from an equitable lens, and to foster a sense of community and belonging for each student while being able to honor each student's diverse backgrounds and identities. And as part of our upcoming next Jammy event in November, we'll be focusing on navigating identities in the workplace, which is that you'll hear from specific panelists and guest speakers that will talk about navigating identities that are not always visible in the workplace. And this is scheduled for next month, November 15th on Wednesday noon, from noon to 1. We look forward to seeing you all there.
Thank you, Usman. So then I would just like to invite all of you at this point to share your feedback on how our session was today, that your feedback helps inform our future Jammy Communities of Practice program. So Sophia will drop a link in the chat for those of you who registered on Handshake, if you complete our brief evaluation, and you'll be entered in an opportunity drawing for an Amazon gift card. And now I'd like to also turn it over to Sophia, who will share a little bit about how you can engage with GSEP on social media. Sophia?
Thank you. Yes, thank you everyone for being here today. I know that this was an amazing session and we definitely don't want you to miss the next one. So I urge you to follow us on Instagram, share this with everybody, get our community really strong so we can have more great events like this. We just really want to thank you for being here today. We also have a LinkedIn alumni group. We would love to stay connected with you, hear your stories, and just support you in any way that we can. So thank you so much for being here, and I'll pass this to Yas. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us today, being part of the conversation, asking such great questions. And again, thank you to Lori and Dr. J for sharing your experiences and wisdom with us. Your time with us today has truly made an impact. So we look forward to seeing the rest of you on November 15th for our next Jammy session. Thanks so much.